Remember, we was looking at Matthew 24, verses 29 through 31. This that Jesus says at the opening of verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days. Now, if my mind is serving me right, all of the scholars are taking this to be the tribulation of Daniel's 70th week. Also, all the scholars are taking verses 29 through 31 to be Jesus' words concerning his second advent. To me, it is quite clear that what Jesus is speaking here is fulfilled with the opening of the sixth seal. Just in Matthew's account, we have 7 things that Matthew writes of that Jesus says that are fulfilled with the opening of the sixth seal. And in sequence. Now, when you got 7 things paralleling in sequence, then to me, we've got evidence here that these puzzle pieces go together. And what we see happening with the opening of the sixth seal is the fulfilling of what Jesus is saying here. If the tribulation Jesus is speaking of here is Daniel's 70th week, then we ought to be able to interject the phrase or insert the phrase Daniel's 70th week here, where he says the tribulation of those days. And if we do that, notice how it reads. Immediately after Daniel's 70th week shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light. Do you see the problem there? Let me read it a different way and see if you notice something that becomes a problem. Immediately after Daniel's 70th week, the sixth seal shall be opened. Well, listen, if Daniel's 70th week is what Jesus is speaking of here, then that means it would be over. It would be fulfilled before the opening of the sixth seal. It would be fulfilled before the seventh seal is opened. This would mean that Daniel's 70th week is fulfilled before the seventh seal book is opened, before what we have concerning the trumpets, beginning in chapter 8, before anything concerning the vials or Christ's second coming. Now, those that hold to the post-trib rapture view, they definitely see this tribulation as being Daniel's 70th week. But they also agree that what he's speaking of in verse 31 is the rapture. Now, if what he's speaking of in verse 30 is Christ's second advent, then what you have happening is Daniel's 70th week being over before the rapture. And that's the position of the post-trib rapture view. The problem with this is, how do you square that with what Jesus says concerning the days of Noah and the normalcy of that day before God's judgment came? Listen, Daniel's 70th week don't represent any kind of normalcy. Listen, they're not going to be going about their normal day-to-day during Daniel's 70th week. Jesus says in this same Olivet Discourse relating to Daniel's 70th week that then there's going to be a time of great tribulation like there's never been and never going to be. So people are not going to be going about their normal day-to-day during Daniel's 70th week. And so to me, you just come up with a big problem if the tribulation Jesus is speaking of here in verse 29 is Daniel's 70th week. It's like in our day, more and more it seems like the thoughts of man's heart is only evil continually. And does not violence fill the earth in our day? Nowadays, we've seen so many school shootings and so much violence that when we see more about violence, it don't hardly even shake us. Now, something that has helped me to understand this a little better is thinking in terms of the way that it was in Noah's day. And if we look in retrospect to Noah's day, imagine if Jesus was talking about Noah's day and And he said immediately after the tribulation of those days. Well, would we be thinking that the tribulation he's speaking of is the time of God's judgment? No. We would understand that the tribulation he is speaking of is that time that would correspond to when all the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. To that time whenever the Bible says that violence filled the earth. So from Jesus' perspective and what he was telling the disciples, and the time now that has transpired since Jesus spoke of these things, we know looking ahead then in prospect instead of retrospect, Jesus would be talking about the tribulation of those days, and he would be talking about the days that we live in now, where that all the thoughts of man's heart more and more is evil continually, and where that violence fills the earth. We would know that he's talking about what would correspond with Noah's day, in that day before God's judgment. Well, we're living in that day before God's judgment. Even though that all the thoughts of man's heart, it seems to be more and more only evil continually, and whereas violence fills the earth, that's our normal. Everybody is seeing this as the normal for our day. But when God's judgment comes, that will not be normal. Like today, God's judgment could begin today, and then we would be taken out of this time of tribulation that we are in, like that Noah was taken out of the tribulation, the time of tribulation that he was in, whenever that they boarded the ark and were spared from God's judgment. I cannot accept that the tribulation that Jesus is speaking of here is Daniel's 70th week. To me, I just don't see that fitting. Not whenever you consider what we find in the Revelation and you begin to try to assemble the puzzle pieces, it just doesn't fit. And what we have Jesus speaking of in verses 29 through 31, that being Christ's second advent, well, that doesn't fit.